The shipyard gates in the Polish city of Gdańsk, all the way up north on the Baltic Sea, clanged shut on August 14, 1980. The sound echoed far beyond Poland's borders. Inside, striking workers had begun something unprecedented in the communist world, demanding not just better wages, but the right to form their own truly independent union. At the heart of this defiance stood Solidarność, or Solidarity in English, a movement that would topple a government without firing a shot. Following World War II, Poland became a Soviet satellite with a one-party communist system that suppressed political dissent and imposed centralized economic planning. While initial reconstruction efforts brought some stability, by the 1970s Poland faced growing economic hardship, food shortages, and a disillusioned workforce. By 1980, it was suffocating under complete economic collapse. Store shelves sat empty, inflation spiraled beyond control, and workers watched their purchasing power evaporate. The communist government had crushed previous uprisings in 1956, 1970, and 1976. Yet something different stirred in the Lenin shipyard that August morning, when electrician Lech Wałęsa climbed over the fence to join his fellow workers. What began as a labor dispute transformed into something the communist world had never seen. A mass movement uniting factory workers, university professors, and Catholic priests under a single banner. Within months, Solidarity claimed over 10 million members, nearly 1 in 3 Polish adults. The government found itself facing not a handful of dissidents, but an entire society organized against it. Wałęsa, with his walrus mustache and gift for plain-spoken defiance, became the face of this peaceful revolution. When martial law descended in December 1981, Solidarity survived underground. When the economy finally forced the government to negotiate in 1989, Solidarity sat at the table as an equal partner. By year's end, Poland had elected its first non-communist government since the 1940s, setting off a cascade of democratic revolutions across Eastern Europe that would ultimately topple the Berlin Wall and dissolve the Soviet Union itself. The war left Poland broken. 6 million dead. Warsaw reduced to rubble. Entire Jewish communities erased. But Poland's suffering didn't end with Hitler's defeat. At Yalta and Potsdam, Churchill and Roosevelt handed Stalin the keys to Eastern Europe, and Poland found itself traded from one master to another. Stalin wasted no time. By 1947, his hand-picked Polish communists had eliminated every trace of opposition through rigged elections, midnight arrests, and show trials that sent thousands to prison. The Polish United Workers' Party ruled alone, answering only to Moscow. Churches were shuttered, farms seized for collective ownership, and anyone who dared speak against the system vanished into the network of prisons that honeycombed the country. When Stalin died in 1953, Poles dared to hope. The Polish October of 1956 brought Władysław Gomułka to power on promises of reform, but the changes proved cosmetic. Real political pluralism remained out of reach. The 1960s dragged on with chronic shortages and crumbling infrastructure. In the 1970s, Edward Gierek tried to modernize Poland with Western loans, building factories and promising prosperity. But the borrowed money ran out just as global recession hit. The result was widespread inflation, rationing, and growing unrest. Workers had reached their breaking point before. In 1970, when the government announced food price increases just before Christmas, shipyard workers in Gdańsk took to the streets. Security forces opened fire, leaving dozens dead in the snow. Similar scenes played out in Szczecin and other cities, but the protests were crushed and forgotten. By the late 1970s, something had changed. Underground groups like the Workers' Defense Committee began connecting isolated pockets of resistance. Intellectuals secretly printed banned books. Workers whispered about their rights. The Catholic Church, never fully silenced, provided meeting spaces and moral authority. Poland was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. And in summer 1980, that spark finally came. On August 14, 1980, at the Lenin Shipyard in Gdańsk, workers put down their tools and refused to pick them up again. They protested not only rising meat prices and poor working conditions, but also demanded broader political changes, most notably the right to form independent trade unions, free from government control. Lech Wałęsa arrived that morning by climbing over the shipyard fence, a symbolic act that would be remembered for decades. The electrician had previously been fired for his activism and was already known to the secret police. Now he was calling workers to join a strike unlike any before. Within days, it spread to other factories and industries, paralyzing large parts of the economy. On August 17, strikers formed the MKS, which coordinated demands from across the region. They issued the now famous 21 demands, not just for higher wages, but for the release of political prisoners, freedom of speech, and the right to strike against the state itself. What made the movement unprecedented was its discipline, breadth, and the coalition it fostered. Factory workers were joined by intellectuals, students, and members of the Catholic Church, which provided spiritual and moral backing. The government, stunned by the scope of the movement and fearful of Soviet intervention, as had happened in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, ultimately agreed to negotiate. On August 31st, Wałęsa sat across from government officials and signed the Gdańsk Agreement with an oversized souvenir pen. For the first time in Soviet Bloc history, a communist government had legally recognized an independent trade union. Within weeks, 10 million Poles, nearly every third adult in the country, had joined Solidarity. Factory workers, teachers, farmers, even some party members signed up for this movement that promised to renew their nation. The government soon realized its mistake. What had seemed like a manageable labor dispute had become an existential threat to communist rule. In the West, politicians cheered this peaceful challenge to Soviet power. In Rome, a Polish pope offered his blessing. 10 million Poles had tasted freedom, and the government couldn't make them forget the flavor. By late 1981, Solidarity had grown beyond a trade union into something approaching a parallel state, with its own newspapers, its own meetings, its own vision of Poland's future. Although the government had legalized Solidarity under pressure, it never accepted the union as a permanent feature of political life. As the economy continued to falter and workers demanded further reforms, tensions escalated between Solidarity and the regime. In response, General Wojciech Jaruzelski, who had recently become both prime minister and head of the Communist Party, made a decisive move. On December 13, 1981, he declared martial law, citing the need to prevent social chaos and potential Soviet intervention. In a pre-dawn operation, thousands of Solidarity activists, including Lech Wałęsa, were arrested, and the movement was forcibly dismantled. Tanks rolled into the streets, military censors took over the media, and civil liberties were suspended. The government outlawed Solidarity with the intention to crush its network entirely. Despite the crackdown, Solidarity did not disappear, it adapted. Driven underground, the movement maintained a resilient clandestine structure. Secret printing presses circulated underground newspapers and leaflets. Activists smuggled information, coordinated strikes, and organized international advocacy. The Catholic Church, led by Pope John Paul II, remained one of the few public institutions that could operate outside strict state control. Church leaders provided space, protection, and spiritual encouragement to the opposition. Western governments watched Poland's tragedy with growing anger. Ronald Reagan imposed economic sanctions on Jaruzelski's regime. Behind the scenes, covert support, including funding, equipment, and communication tools, was funneled to the underground movement through various channels, including the CIA and AFL-CIO. Solidarity became a global symbol of nonviolent resistance to oppression. The regime thought it had won, but victory felt hollow. Poland's economy continued its death spiral, weighed down by foreign debt, international isolation, and the simple fact that you can't force people to work enthusiastically at gunpoint. Even party officials began whispering that martial law had solved nothing. In 1983, Wałęsa received the Nobel Peace Prize, a recognition that made him too famous to disappear quietly. The electrician from Gdańsk had become an international symbol, protected by global attention, even as police followed his every step. Underground, new leaders emerged to replace those in prison, training in secret, preparing for whatever came next. The 1980s dragged on with Poland trapped between a discredited government and a movement forced into shadows. By 1988, Poland was bleeding money and running out of time. Foreign debt had ballooned beyond any hope of repayment. Store shelves sat bare, and the government's promises of reform rang hollow after years of broken pledges. Meanwhile, from Moscow came whispers that changed everything. Mikhail Gorbachev was letting the Soviet Empire loosen its grip. The tanks that had crushed Hungary and Czechoslovakia would not be coming to save Poland's communists. When strikes erupted again in 1988, General Jaruzelski, instead of sending police to break up the strikes, picked up the phone and called Lech Wałęsa. After 8 years underground, Solidarity was being invited back to the surface. Beginning in early 1989, the roundtable talks brought together representatives from the government, Solidarity, and other social groups in a series of unprecedented negotiations. Over 2 months, the parties debated political reform, economic liberalization, and the future role of trade unions. Despite moments of deadlock, the talks produced a landmark agreement. Solidarity would be legalized again, and partially free elections would be held in June 1989. Although the Communist Party reserved a guaranteed number of seats in parliament, the remaining seats were open to democratic competition. The results were stunning. In contest after contest, Solidarity candidates demolished their communist opponents. The party that had ruled Poland for 4 decades won exactly 0 competitive seats in the lower house and managed just 1 seat in the Senate. The Communist Party was humiliated and its moral authority shattered. Though the party still technically held power, it could no longer govern without Solidarity's consent. A series of rapid developments followed. In August 1989, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, a longtime Solidarity advisor, became prime minister, forming the first non-communist government in the Eastern Bloc since World War II. In a matter of weeks, Poland had transitioned from authoritarian rule to democratic governance, not through violent revolution, but through negotiation and consensus. The news flashed across the Iron Curtain like electricity. In East Berlin, Leipzig, and Prague, opposition leaders, who had watched Poland's transformation with growing excitement, began planning their own challenges to communist rule. The impossible had become inevitable. The Berlin Wall would fall, the Velvet Revolution would triumph in Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Empire would simply melt away. With the fall of communist rule in 1989, Lech Wałęsa, once a shipyard electrician and underground activist, became the most recognizable face of Poland's transformation. In 1990, he was elected President of Poland in the country's first fully democratic election, defeating the more moderate Tadeusz Mazowiecki in a landslide. Wałęsa's victory was both symbolic and historic. The former dissident had now become head of state in a free Poland. Solidarity's victory came with complications that success often brings. The movement that had united 10 million Poles against communism splintered into competing political parties once democracy arrived. Former allies found themselves on opposite sides of elections, arguing over economic policy and the pace of reform. The solidarity that had been forged in struggle proved harder to maintain in freedom. Yet, its deeper legacy endured in the institutions it helped create and the values it embedded in Polish society. The country that had been isolated behind the Iron Curtain steadily moved toward the West, joining NATO in 1999 as insurance against any return to foreign domination, then entering the European Union in 2004 as full partners in the democratic community of nations. The shipyard gates in the Polish city of Gdańsk, all the way up north on the Baltic Sea, clanged shut on August 14, 1980. The sound echoed far beyond Poland's borders.